Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi, Terumos, Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph. We are learning Daf Hey. We left off on Daf Hey Mamish on the top. And let's quickly review where we're at. On Daf Daled Amud Beis, the Gemara brought a brisa in which we have a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim in the following scenario: that when a father brought his son into his gourd field, and the son, a minor, on his own, separated truma. The father comes back at night. Says Rabbi Yehuda that if the father consents, if he agrees to the fact that a son's truma should be a valid separation, then it is indeed truma. And as we mentioned yesterday, there are two chidushim in that. There are two steps that you have to hold to for that halacha to be the way he says it. Number one, this is very important, that generally we learned in our Mishnah, one of the 5 categories of those who cannot separate truma is hatoidem es she'enoi shaloi. If someone separates truma from product that's not his. Now, you can appoint someone to be a shliach, and as we said yesterday, at least according to the Yerushalmi, it's not only if you appoint someone as your shliach, could the shliach separate on your behalf, but even if you don't appoint someone to be a shliach. I'm mentioning this explicitly because a minor can never be appointed as a shliach. There's no shlichus by a minor. But if the person who separated truma did not do an act of thievery, it's not theft. Why would it be theft? Because it's not theirs. In other words, like I mentioned yesterday, if I have tevel, even though I'm not allowed to eat my tevel, but when you separate 2% of it for the kohen, that is b'chlal not mine. Something was mine, and now it's not mine. You don't have the right to do that. But if the person consents, then you could do it. Now, there's a lot more to be said about this, but let's leave it at that. So that's number one. The ikir is number two. So we have to address that. So the consent of the owner later takes away the problem, especially if it's family. I'm going to add that line of hatoidem eshe eno shaloi. But there's another issue. The other issue is that a minor cannot separate truma at all, even if it's his product. So from here you see that Rabbi Yehuda holds that a minor could separate truma. Now the Chachamim of the Brisa say the following. They say that no, just the father's consent is not enough. The words of the Brisa is that if the father is imein al yodoi, and the way we explain the imein al yodoi, literally it would mean if the father takes the son's hand and does it. Shkoyach. There's no chiddush to that. The son's hand becomes like an instrument. Imein al yodoi means that if the father adds to the truma, that means he does an action, and through the action he's revealing that not only he's consenting, he's not adding to it. So even the Chachamim will hold, even though a minor cannot separate truma, the father's adding doesn't only elevate the addition, it somehow elevates everything. Everything becomes truma. Then the Gemara asks, and that's what we're in the middle of the question. Okay, according to the Chachamim, a minor cannot separate truma, but when the father is imein al yodoi, somehow everything becomes truma. Question is it retroactive? Does it make everything truma from when the minor separated, from when the son separated? Or is it only mikano lahaba? Because the Chachamim hold that a minor cannot separate truma. That was the Gemara's question.
What? As long as it becomes truma, it doesn't matter if it became truma half an hour earlier or not.
So let's go Aviv. So therefore we learned the Marafulda. And quickly, that if someone has a certain level of truma called the Tful Yom, that person who has contact with chulin food will not contaminate the chulin food. That person's halachic contact with truma food will be metame the truma. So in between the minor separation and the father's adding, such a person touched that product. If it's retroactive, then it's tamei. Big difference. If it doesn't go retroactive, even though now it's all truma, it won't be tamei because the contact of the tful yom was on chulin. That's the nafkamina. And for that, the Gemara brought a different Baraisa. See, the Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim is when someone has their son in their field. And this family link is important when it comes to shlichus. We'll mention it in a moment when we learn inside. The braisa that we're trying to use to resolve this inquiry, guys, halt cup, because we're in the middle of it. A stranger goes into your field and he begins to separate truma. And then the balabas comes back at night and he sees this guy separating truma. So here also the braisa says that here there's no minor issue, an adult did it. The issue more is that it's hatoidim eshe eina shaloi. That and the balabas says, why didn't you take from the better ones? If there are better ones, then we understand that statement not to be a cynical statement, to be a real statement. In other words, not only do I agree with what you did, I'm upset. You could have done it even better. He agreed. If he agreed, then it's a truma. Again, we're following an approach that you don't have to mamish have shlichus. He consented. He showed that he's not upset. But if there is no better ones, so then we interpret a statement as cynical statement, like, well, who are you to do it? Why didn't you take even from the better ones? He didn't agree to it. So that stranger had no power to separate them. Now that's where we left off. We're going to start on Daf Hey today to conclude indeed a proof. We will conclude and prove from this braisa, after we read the remaining part of the braisa, the resolution whether it's mikanu lahaba or lemafreya. The Gemara later is going to bring another braisa that will give us the source from where do we know that someone cannot separate truma from product that's not theirs. It's really learned from a pasuk in Parshas Koirach. Now the pasuk in Parshas Koirach actually is speaking about trumas meiser, but truma gedoyla and trumas meiser go together, even though they're very different, as we'll speak out, as we'll learn in this Masechta, but they're both truma. When it comes to the Levi's separating from what the Levi received, 10%, Trumas Meiser, the Torah uses extra words, gam atem, and we learn from the atem, v'loi shutfim, atem v'loi apitropis, atem v'loi hatoidem eshe ena shaloi. That will be the source, and we're going to explain what that means, and that will be a big part of the daf today. We're going to have another very interesting Aviv Halkop. What's the issue? Guys, listen. By hatoidem eshe ena shaloi. Is the problem because it belongs to someone else, or is the problem simply because it's not mine? What's the difference? I'll tell you the differences. What happens if there's produce that's hefker, and I see it, I am not acquiring it, I'm leaving it hefker, but I separated truma. If the problem of hatoidem eshe eina shaloi is it's not mine, hefker is not mine, then my separation is nothing. But if the issue with hatoidem eshe eina shaloi is because it belongs to someone else, so who am I to do it? Hefker belongs to no one else. Then my separation should be valid.
Right. By separating it, aren't you causing it to be yours by touching it?
No, it's not, because when I have contact with it, I have to make a kinyan. And if my manipulating it, even if I lifted it or I made meshicha on it, if it's not with the intent of acquiring it, I don't acquire.
Got it.
And when the Gemara is going to be trying to resolve that inquiry, I don't know if we'll finish that today or tomorrow. Ultimately, this inquiry will be unresolved. The Gemara is going to speak a little bit about the relationship between the temple treasurers, between the gizbar, between the temple treasurer and items that belong to Hegdish. In other words, how much of a jurisdiction does a gizbar have? Gizbar, again, is the Beis Hamikdash treasurer, the person in charge of the things with those things that belong to Hegdish. It's Hegdish, but on the other hand, he's in charge of it. And that will be a very interesting topic. In every shul, you have the treasurer. Like, who is the balabas over what? That will be a little bit of the discussion. Anyways, this is a good intro, and now we're going to come right back to Daf Hamad Aleph. So we are in middle of the Brais. So again, the balabas comes back. He tells the person, Kalach Eitzel Yafis, why didn't you go to the better ones? So we already explained what happens. Now, there we have to see whether there were better ones or not to interpret whether he was cynical or not. Continues the Braisa, but if the owner comes back and he doesn't say anything, you know what he does? He does something similar to what we learned by the Chachamim. He comes back and he adds to the Truma. He does an action by adding mamish the way It's exactly what the Chachamim said, the way we teach the Chachamim, Imein al Yodai, with the father son. Here it's a stranger, balabas and a stranger. So then, benkach, whether there is better or not, even if he says, why didn't you go to the better ones? And there are no better ones, and there are no better ones. So you would normally say, he was cynical. If he actually adds to the truma, einoi choishesh mishum gazel. This Braisa holds, again, the issue is more about Gezela. Since the owner added, that's proof that he's satisfied with the designation, and therefore it's Truma. End of Braisa. Now, says Rab Shimi, concludes the Gemara the proof to our question, whether Lemafreya or Mikana Lahaba, Islach Meimar Lemafreya Nasis Truma. This is Gavaldik. For sure, it cannot be Lemafreya. And let me tell you why. Now, here it gets a little bit nuanced. Retroactive. Even though we're learning good chevra, that according to the Yerushalmi, shlichus is not essential always. The issue of atoidim eshe'ena shaloi is about, it's like gzela, and when you resolve the gzela, it's less problematic. Nevertheless, unlike a father and a son, at the end of the day, the son has a relationship with the father. There, one might have said that as long as the father added, according to the Chachamim, it goes retroactive. Here, you cannot say it goes retroactive because the stranger is a stranger. And the rule is that you cannot separate Truma from something that's not yours. So when he separated the Truma, the stranger, Vadai, it's not Truma. Even after the Balabas added, it's a given. It's no way it goes retroactive. What we say is that since the Balabas added, it's as if there was a separation happening now. Now, this is all says the Gemara, Loi Mikan Lahaba, it has to be Mikan Lahaba. So therefore, must be that the same will be by the case of the minor. Now, why must it be? Because the case of the minor and the case of the stranger is in the same Braisa. And B'chlal, there's a way of understanding how to learn the Torah Shabbal Peh. The fact that we juxtapose in the same Braisa two cases, one of the reasons behind it, why didn't you make it into two different like Braisas, two different Mishnahs? You made it into the same with a beginning and an end to tell you that it works, that it's the same rule. So Ufhachi, also in the Reisha, in the case of the minor, only Mikan Olaba Nasas Truma. Now, two things. First of all, again, the fact that the Gemara's response is that it for sure cannot mean retroactive, one might have understood from the Braisa. Why for sure? Because Rab Shimi holds there has to be shlichus. A minor is he's the son of the father, so there's already a connection, and therefore in the Bavli, the rule is that the only way I can separate Truma from your product is if I am your proxy. The Rambam does not paskin that way. The Rambam actually holds that even a non-proxy, as long as we know that the owner was fine with it, can separate Truma. Now, does that mean that the Rambam didn't accept Rab Shimi's proof as a halacha? I don't know how he learned this Gemara over here. Maybe because of juxtapose. No. But I'm saying the point is that if you don't need shlichus, and if the owner revealed his consent now, so why? If you don't need shlichus, one could argue it can go retroactive. Anyways, this is the big topic. This Yerushalmi is ground zero to those who explain Shitas HaRambam, which is not like the Bavli, that you don't need shlichus. It's from our sugi. Now, I want to bring up one topic, which is extremely important. I know we spoke about it in the last Masechta way in Shvius. We spoke about this, or maybe even before that. Once Truma is separated, remember what I'm saying. Once Truma is separated, you cannot add to the Truma. No such a thing. Why not? Because from the Truma, Aviv, from the Truma, the Levi gets nothing. From the Truma, Meiser Sheni gets nothing. From the Truma, Meiser Ani gets nothing. What you gave to the Kohen, the coin gets to eat it. From the remaining, you have to separate, give to the Levi, then you have to separate another tithing. Now, truth be told, the Torah doesn't give a shear to Truma. Okay. So if a person wants, and they separate 50% of their product to the kohen at one time, it's going to be okay, even though that would mean the Levi would get a lot less. But once you separated the Truma, everything else now is obligated to have Ma'aser Rishon separated from it. If I add to the Truma, I'm stealing from the Levi. I cannot do that. So the kasha of our Gemara is both in the case of the father and the son, the minor, and in the case of the stranger. How can you add? What does adding do? And especially according to the understanding that it goes lemafreya, the Gemara had two sides. Mele, if it's only mikanu lahaba, I can explain. Mikanu lahaba means that what the minor did is zero, what the stranger did is nothing, even though the father or the owner didn't actually separate the first separation, but when they added to it, it's as if they did the whole thing. That would work. That would work. In other words, it doesn't add to it, it's making it. But if you're going to say it's retroactive, like how does that work? So you have to say something gavaldic, that even according to the side of the inquiry that it goes retroactive, but prior to the father's adding, we don't know whether the truma was truma. Actually, the way it is, it's not truma yet. So that does give the father or the balabas the ability to add, because it's not mamish adding. Even if it's retroactive, it's not adding. It's that prior to them doing anything, there's no clear truma. It's a vague truma. To that could be added to. Okay, let's move on right. This is, by the way, this is what Tosfos says in Bavli about this topic. That would not change. It means even if you don't need shlichus, but you have to have the owner's acknowledgement that he's fine with it. And prior to that, since it's not fixed truma, so then you can't say you can't add to it because it's not clear what it is. We don't know what it is yet. Very good. Okay. Now, again, the Mishnah gave the chedesh, the 5. Chedesh, shoyta. Chedesh, shoyta. I'm afraid to say that word because they shall come back. And the minor. And now we have the 4th is hatoinem eshe'ena shaloi. This is the 4th category. And now, what's the source that you cannot separate truma if it doesn't belong to you? So says the Gemara that we have a pasuk in Parshas Koirach. Just to know, the pasuk reads that Kain torimu gam atem trumas Hashem mikoil ma'isroi sechem asher tikchu meis b'nei Yisrael unesatem imenu was trumas Hashem la'aron hakohen. Guys, whoever, I just read the pasuk. I didn't read it from memory. I read it from the Torah Yerushalmi. So in Parshas Koirach, after the rebellion, the Torah reiterates the Chav Dalet Matnos Kahuna, and one of the 424 gifts, one of them comes from the Levi. Now, there's Truma Gedoyla and there's Trumas Ma'aser. And I want you to know they're very different. Trumas Ma'aser is exact, 10%. Not more, not less. You have to give 10%. Truma Gedoyla is not exact. In other words, it's not only midoiraisa you can get away with a minimum amount. Even when the Chachamim said, no, give one of 40, give one of 50, give one of 60. Let's say the average person gives 2%, one of 50. It's not given precise, purposefully. So they are different in how they're given. Do you give it per estimation? Do you give it with precision? Nevertheless, they're both truma. And as we'll see in our sugya, we can learn all of the dinim one from the other. So even though the verse that we are quoting is specifically by Trumas Ma'aser, but the same of Trumas Ma'aser, the same for Truma Gedoyla. Now, the Torah could have said, Kain torimu Trumas Hashem. It's just like the Yisrael has to give Truma. So the Torah says, similarly, when the Levi gets his Ma'aser Rishon, he also gives a Truma. The words Gam Atem are completely extra. So from Atem, we learn the following. From the Atem prat l'shutafim. Don't jump out of your seat because we're going to clarify what we're saying. But what we are saying is that if 2 partners or more own produce, right? Let's say together, me and you, we own 100 apples. I cannot go, and let's say I'm going to give the 2%. I cannot give the 2% prior to becoming your proxy or getting your consent. I cannot on my own go ahead and separate 2% by claiming, what's the difference? Even though really the 100 apples is 50-50. So really from 50, how many apples have to be given? 1. Who am I to give to? Right? One might have thought I could give to. Why? Because we're partners.
50-50 doesn't have to be like 50, 90, 40, 60.
Whatever the partnership is. The point is that one might have thought that if partnership would mean that everyone has a ownership and a part of everything, which is one of the ways you look at partnerships, one would have thought, I don't need your consent. We're religious people. We're going to give truma anyway. Torah says, no. That without me getting your consent, I cannot separate on your behalf. That's the prat l'shutafim. Atem, another exclusion, prat la'apitroipen. That if you have a administrator looking after the estate of minors, let's leave it at that he cannot separate truma. People are going to say, so what should the minors do? This has to be explained. In other words, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that a minor can separate melim. If the administrator cannot separate it, let the minor. But we don't paskin like the Rabbi Yehuda. The Chachamim hold a minor cannot separate. If the administrator cannot separate and the minor cannot separate, how are they going to eat the food? You have to separate truma. We'll get back to that. And the third thing that we learn from the atem is atem prat l'toinem eshe'enu shaloi. You, in other words, you can only separate from yours. You cannot separate that from what belongs to someone else for them, even though they have to do it. You cannot do it. By the way, normally you cannot learn 3 things from the same verse. You could, because it's one limud. It's all about you from yours, and not. In other words, there are many knots, but it's all because it's not atem. It has to be the atem. Now the Gemara, let's unpackage each one. Let's go, guys. We have to get moving. Atem v'lo shutafim asks the Gemara. Hold on, we're going to have a mishnah in this mesechta. According to the pagination that we are using, the daf chav zayin amud beis. Mishnah writes clearly. Listen, shutafim shutar muzeh achar zeh. Truma. When someone went ahead, 2 partners, right? Me and you, Aviv. So I separated the whole thing. Let's say we have 100 apples. I separated 2 apples. You didn't know that. So you went ahead and you separated 2 apples. So there's a machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Akiva. The Chachamim hold that what I separated is completely truma. And by the way, that's the rule. Since what I separated is completely truma, what you did is nothing. Because once truma said, you can't add to it. So 1 second. How is it even shaykh? We just learned that partners cannot separate without the consent of the other. How can there be such a case that one partner separated and the other partner separated? Clearly, you see that one partner could separate without the knowledge of the other. So the initial answer of the Gemara is, I'll tell you the difference. Which means the beraisa that disallows partners separating one for the other is only about Truma Gedoyla. And why would that be? I just explained, because by Truma Gedoyla, we don't give a fixed amount. In other words, if it's not a fixed amount, first of all, even if you want 1 out of 50, maybe you are more generous. Maybe you want to separate 1 from 40. Maybe the other partner is more stingy. They want to separate 1 from 60. So since it varies the amount, that's why it would make sense that one partner cannot do it without the consent of the other. The other person would say, I would separate a different amount. Perhaps. That's a good answer, but we're going to refute it. However, the Mishnah that clearly is speaking about one partner doing it without the consent of the other, the Mishnah is speaking about Trumas Meiser. Trumas Meiser has to be precise. Al tarbe la'aser umadois. We're not allowed to give Meiser, including Trumas Meiser, by estimation. It has to be exact. Since all partners know exactly 10% from the Levi will be given, so then one can do for the other, because you're going to do the same thing anyways. So the Gemara says, logically, you're right, but I reject the answer. Why? Because klum lamdu l'truma gedoyla ela mitrumas meiser. Do we not learn the rules from trumas meiser? Like, how do we know, like we mentioned, that you cannot give a truma for that which is not yours? From the word atem. Yeah, where did Hashem write the word atem? By trumas meiser. And the rule is that everything, all of the rules that apply to one, apply to the other. So even though logically what you're saying is correct, but it's wrong. That's not the way we learn. Since the Torah teaches us the dinim in Trumas Meiser. And from there, we learn from Truma Gedoyla, you cannot make this differentiation. So the Gemara gives another answer, and that will be the answer. Ella, listen, this is called halacha and halacha lemaisa, or halacha lemaisa. Halacha means after the fact. That's the way it's applied over here. In other words, when the Mishnah validates the separation from one partner, even though the other one did not know, and according to the Chachamim, therefore, as we'll see, all of the consequences of that, that is if it happened. The Braisa that says Atem v'loy shutafim, lemaisa means not pre-facto. Halacha lemaisa means when someone asks you, what should I do? Halacha lemaisa, you tell them what to do. You would tell a partner, don't do it without the consent of the other. Lachatchila, very good. Okay. Weiter, it says the Gemara, the next thing we learned in the Braisa is Atem v'lo yapitropin, that Atem, you from yours, and not you, even though that you are a administrator, or you are a guardian, or you are some sort of custodian over the state of the minors, you cannot do it. Now, before, like I mentioned, there's a logical question. So what should happen? But the whole food should go to waste? The Gemara is going to ask from a Mishnah. Frag the Gemara, and we learned the Mishnah Masechtes Gitin in Bavli. It's on Dafnun Beis. Yesoimim shesamchu eitzel balabayis. Now let me just give you 3 types of apitrupin. What would be the best type of apitrupin in English? Probably a custodian. Custodian is a shomer. Okay, I'll go to the apitrupin. Guys, like this. There is the apitrupis that was appointed by the father prior to his passing. These things make a difference. There is the apitropis, executor. There is the executor that's appointed by the Beis Din, which it could happen. A person passes away, a tragedy, they weren't prepared, they didn't give instructions. The orphans are minors. Beis Din has a responsibility to help them. And if the father or Beis Din appointed someone, their appointment has greater strength, and then there is a scenario where not there is the father, not there is a Beis Din, a person on their own wanted to be of help, and the kids agreed, but that relationship is halachically weaker, because they weren't appointed officially, not by the father nor by the Beis Din. So the Mishnah writes, this is a Mishnah, that's called Yesoimim shesamchu eitzel balabayis. So there's a balabas from his own compassion. No one, when there's no man, be the man. He walked in over there and he decided, I'm going to help the chevra. Oy shemina aviyam apitropin, or if the father is the one that appointed. And by the way, father appointed and Beis Din appointed will be the same. Says the Mishnah, chayovim la'asir peiroseim. Chayovim means lechatchila. You can't say that if they did it, it's done. In other words, part of the responsibility, part of the responsibility of an apitropis is to see to it that the things of the orphans don't go to waste. You have food, aside of the mitzvah of separating. If you don't separate, you can't eat it. Mamash, a contradiction. So the Gemara answers, the chevre responded, Kan ba'apitropis lo oilam, the Mishnah that allows the apitropis and not allows chayev is when we're speaking about a permanent apitropis. No, we always want a permanent. In other words, right after the passing, it's very common that before things get settled, it's clear. It's a temporary until when we discover who's going to do what. That's someone who's temporary. And when the Braisa says that Atem excludes an apitropis, that's a logic, is apitropis l'shah. And that's a person, by the way, it could turn out that the temporary will then be appointed to be permanent. But it could turn out that the guy that was appointed temporarily will be demoted in an hour. That makes sense. So that person doesn't separate. That's something you have to have more balabatishkeit. Asks the Gemara, says the Gemara, Rabbi Yossi, if the Mishnah is speaking about someone who's a permanent administrator, okay, regarding the case of the Mishnah, says the Braisa. Now you're saying the Mishnah is speaking about someone who is already he's the designated permanent administrator, executor. It says in the Braisa that moicher u'metaltel v'zar. What happens if there's not enough geld? So the apitropis has the right to sell movables for the orphans, for them to have food, But the apotropos never has the right to sell real estate. The question is, if the Mishnah is speaking about a permanent executor whose job is to provide for the orphans, l'choira, he should have the right to do anything needed. Now, of course, you won't appoint someone who's going to sell real estate if there would be a better solution. But to say categorically they can never sell land, that would fit if someone is only a temporary apotropos. But now that you said the Mishnah is speaking about a permanent, and on the Braisa says it doesn't work, so we reject the answer. Muzman Zagin. Now, what's the difference between the Mishnah and our Braisa? Ella kan b'yasam gadol is important. The Braisa is speaking about an orphan who is an adult. That makes sense. Don't think adult orphans. Adult orphans, chavre, means bar mitzvah kids. And try to remember how you were when you were bar mitzvah, or 13, or 14, or 15, or 16, like the Bachram over here. Many people, prior to them engaging in the business world, understand that we don't fully understand how things work. So even when you have a halachically minor child, it's to their advantage. God forbid, it shouldn't be. A father passes away, so the kids are teenagers. So what? What, they're so savvy, people will take advantage of them. So this is good. So when the kids are adults, the Braisa says the apotropos should not do the separating. You know why? Let the kids do it. They're not kids. That's what we explained. Like, what should you have? Food. What, you're not going to separate trumos? But what happens if the children are minors? They halachically cannot, like we learned in our Mishnah. We don't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. So since they cannot, the apotropos has to do it. That fits. Kan, the Mishnah is b'yasam cotton, the Gavaldik answer. Turning to Daf Hamad Beis. Now the third limit we had was atem prat. That you have to separate implies that you can only separate from that which belongs to you and not from produce that is not yours. So as we spoke out in the intro, there are two ways of understanding the exclusion of that which is not yours. Is the issue that I cannot separate truma, that belongs to someone else, and especially as we spoke out here in the Yerushalmi, that it might not necessarily demand the agency, shlichus. It's more about gezela. How can I separate truma from produce that's not mine when that act takes away the balabatishkeit from the owner, from the truma, because the truma no longer belongs to the owner, even though the owner has the right to choose which coin to give it to, but it's not his. In other words, is it since it belongs to someone else, I cannot do it? And therefore, in the case of hefker, Kavan, if I don't pick it up to acquire it, I'm only separating truma. It's a mitzvah. By the way, you make a bracha. A person said, I want to chaparayim the mitzvah. And not only that, he'll make a siman. They used to have utensils. And on the utensils, they would have a tuf, which would mean truma. They would have mem, that would mean maised. We're going to learn about that later. You know, I'll do the separation. Or, no, if it's not mine, I cannot do it. Not because of, it's not mine to do. And even hefker cannot be done. That's the Gemara's inquiry. Ma avidle, how do you understand the exclusion of you can't do if it's not yours? Is it betoirem eshe'enoi shaloi? Is it because it's not yours? That means even if the produce does not belong to someone else, but if it's not yours, you cannot do it. You're not the balabas. Or no, the exclusion is you can't do it because it belongs to someone else, which then would mean that if it's hefker, you could do it. How beautiful. Yeah, Aviv, you got it? Great question. So let's try. Let's go for a ride. So says the Gemara, okay, whether we have the girsa nishma ina min hada or not, here we go. Hifkir kiryoi. We're explaining. If someone, what's the nafkamina? The Gemara speaks out. If someone declared his pile of produce ownerless, and then they smooth the pile. Now, these words are extremely important, and we're going to read the Gemara with this girsa, and then in a moment from now, we're going to read the girsa of the Gra in Ksav Yad Aleph, which has a different girsa. Let me go two steps. Let's first, the way we have the version. From when is someone obligated to separate truma? You're only obligated to separate truma, guys. Let's remember this: when the product is a completed product. The words are when there is Gemar Malacha. Sometimes Gemar Malacha in itself is not enough. It also has to go into the home. It's called the Re'iyas Pnei Habayis. We're not going to speak about this right now. Let's speak about Gemar Malacha. When we're speaking about items that grow in fields, particularly grains, the way it worked is that they would harvest it, they would bring it to the threshing floor, they would thresh it, they would winnow it. In other words, they would do all of the steps necessary to remove the impurities from the kernels, from the grains themselves, and then they would smooth the pile. Mei ruach. The smoothing of the pile on the threshing floor in the field, that was normally the final step, after which now it's a final product. Actually, when people sold that which they grew, if they didn't eat it, they would sell it from the threshing floor. There was no supermarkets the way you have today. If you want to get a good price, let's say I would have a field, I would tell you this X amount per pound, and the customer, you would come to my threshing floor to pick it up. This is important. Now, when a product is ownerless products do not necessitate having any trumas or meiser separated from it. Mida oiraisa, if someone has produce, and prior to the smoothing, the chiyuv only goes into effect when you smooth the pile. If prior to the smoothing, the person says it's ownerless, and then they smooth the pile, and again, Kavan, smoothing of the pile, if I don't do that with the intent of acquiring it, doesn't acquiring it, then midda oiraisa, nothing has to be tithed. However, Chachamim say that if the person who declared it hefker, if he reacquires it within 72 hours, within 3 days, midrabanan, he's obligated to tithe it. Because if not, everyone will make a gimmick. It's a threshing floor. Even when I declare something ownerless, if you don't know that I declared it ownerless, or we just had this in Shavuos, if I'm going to call my chaverim, let's say that the declaration of ownerless has to be done in front of 2 or in front of 3. If I have 3 friends and I'll scratch your back and you'll scratch my back, I'll call my 3 friends. They won't take it. I'll declare it ownerless. I'm going to smooth the pile, and then I'm going to reacquire it, and I don't have to give any tithing. So the Chachamim say that if I reacquire it within 72 hours, then midrabanan, it's as if I never was mafked it. And therefore, when I smoothed the pile, it was mine, midrabanan, and I'm chayiv to tithe it. Because after that amount of time, even though I called my friends, people are going to find out that I did it, and there I'm going to lose. Someone's going to come and take it. Now, why would the Gemara have to give such a case is really what's bothering the Gra. In other words, according to the way we are reading it, that hifkid, by the way, this is not the first time, in the Yerushalmi, the vase and the pay are intertwined. So it's hifkid. You are mafkid, hifkid kiryoy. Then you smooth it, v'chazir v'zachaboy, prior to the 3 days. Now, why did you have to give such a convoluted case? The Gra's girsa is, now he didn't make it up. He found another text. Midayraisa. We're speaking about someone who's chayiv to tithe. That's the case over here. Look inside the Gra. In the Ksaviyav Aleph is the left column. It's 3 lines from the Tas. Hachi garsinan, stam hifkir kiryoy, v'tarmu v'chazir b'zachaboy. A guy went ahead.
Could also sound as adding on.
No, he's not adding on. I'm saying hefker. It's like a fake. Anyways, whether he was mafked it prior to the smoothing, the Gra takes out the word smoothing. The Gra is simply saying that someone smoothed the pile. There's a chiyuv midoiraisa. He went ahead and he declared it ownerless. And by the way, now that he declared it ownerless, but after the obligation went into effect, whoever will acquire it will have to tithe it. You know, that's simple. So a guy smoothed it. There's a chiyuv. He was mafker it. While it was hefked, he separated truma. I'm just giving you an example. That's the case of, is it? That's the question of Treidim she'ena shaloi. If the exclusion is that if it's not mine, I cannot affect truma, even though it belonged to no one else, because it was hefker, my separation is gurnished. Ein truma say truma. But the Gemara is explaining the two sides of the inquiry. But if you will make the exclusionary limud of the Braisa, that I cannot separate Truma from something that belongs to you. It's not about that it's not mine, it's that it's yours. But if there's no yours, because it's Hefker, so then Truma say Truma. So that's the inquiry. Okay, so now, Nishminim and Adol, let's begin. We are quoting a Mishnah that we have in our pagination on Daf Nun Tes, here in Trumois. Mishnah writes, listen to this case, Gonav Trumas Hegdish V'achalo. You have a rule that if someone steals Truma from a kohen, they are obligated not only to compensate the value of the Truma, but they also have to add a halachic fifth. We have another halacha that if someone, God forbid, steals from Hegdish, they have to compensate not only by returning to Hegdish, the value, they have to add a fifth. Now, the Mishnah is speaking about a case where there is Hegdish that is Truma. And this Chacham, the Ganev, stole it. And he's doing tshuva. So the Mishnah says that he has to give 2/5 because he has to give the 5th because he stole Truma. And he has to give a 5th because he stole from Hegdish. Let's read it inside. Gonav Trumas Hegdish va'achala. Then Mishalem Shnei Chumashin. Now, by the way, when a person is a Ganav, if one steals from something that's not consecrated, there's another rule that if they were caught, not if they did tshuva on their own, not if they were moide, then beknas pater, but if they were caught in their geneva, they have to pay kefil, double. There is no din of kefil by Hegdish. So the Mishnah says, but only v'keren because she ain't behegdish tashlume kefil. Okay, period. Now, the Gemara is asking, what's the case of the Mishnah? You have Hegdish, that's Truma. Exactly how is there Hegdish, that's Truma? Does it not mean that someone consecrated their produce? They smoothed the pile has a value, and they decided they're going to donate it to the Beis HaMikdash. Comes along the Gizbar, the treasurer of the Beis HaMikdash, and now, by the way, if something would have belonged to a Hegdish before the pile being smoothed, just like Hefker does not need to be tithed, neither does Hegdish. But if the smoothing of the pile happened when it belonged to a non-consecrated person, to an individual, to you, to me, even though you were Magdishit prior to the separation of Trumas Umaisres, once the obligation went into effect, you cannot undo it. Okay, so there's a chiyuv of separating, but who did it? The Gizbar. How did the Gizbar do it? It doesn't belong to him. How does the treasurer do it if it doesn't belong to him? So the case is that Manu Toidim, who separated the Truma, Loi Gizber, is it not the treasurer? But hold on. If the exclusion of Atem and not HaToidim She'ena Shaloi would mean that even if it's not mine, even if it's not yours, if it's no one's, I cannot do it, then why would the temple treasurer be able to do it? Beautiful proof. And yet, the Truma is a Truma. Is it not? It's what can you not do? I cannot separate Truma if it belongs to someone else. But if it belongs to no one, and we're saying belonging to no one is similar to belonging to Hegdish, of course, God is ultimate, but it's not to another person, then you can do it. So the Gemara says, no, Nish, that's not a proof. Why not? Oy Neumar. Because I can explain to you the case of the Braisa is not that the Gizbar did it, that man who told him, the case was there was a kohen. A kohen got Truma. What, you think the kohen doesn't make a donation to the Beis HaMikdash? It was already Truma because it was separated by the owner. The kohen consecrated his Truma. Maybe that will be the case. Maybe the Gizbar cannot separate, so there's no proof. So the kohen shehikdish Truma. The Gemara says, no, it's not accurate because on the Mishnah we have a Braisa that was taught by Rabbi Yohishaya that the case of the Mishnah, he writes explicitly, is Echad HaMagdash Tivloi ve'Echad HaMagdash Trumasi. Second case is, the coin was the one that separated Truma. The first scenario would be that someone has Tevel, and they're Magdash it. And how did it become Truma? Because the Gizbar separated it. So if a treasurer can separate, l'cha'ura, I should be able to separate from Hefker. It's already 1 minute. So Davav, just the top, Amar Avidi. No. You cannot compare one case to the other. Gizbar, command the Inun Ba'alim. The temple treasurer is considered the Balabas. In other words, the jurisdiction of the temple treasurer over Hegdish is a lot more than my jurisdiction over Hefker. And even though really it's subject to a machlokes tanoim, we don't have time to get into it, but it's not negeya. In Masechta Shkolim, Rabbi Yossi does not say that, because Rabbi Yossi says, look at Rabbi Yossi. The Rabbi Yossi Yamar hu agizber hu achad. Rabbi Yossi holds that the temple treasurer has no jurisdiction at all more than anyone else. But not like Rabbi Yossi. I think it's over there, Rabbi Yehuda. I think over there, whoever the other Tana is, the treasurer asking the shul's treasurer who owns the stuff. The treasurer of the shul would say, it's all mine. He's the not mine for me. In other words, a treasurer makes sense. A treasurer was appointed to overlook. So he has a bigger balabatischkeit. So you cannot prove from the case of the Gizbar to our question. And indeed, the Gemara leaves this question unresolved. Gavaldik, to be continued.
Fair.
On time.